My son sat across from me at my own kitchen table and asked for another $80,000. 6 weeks earlier, I had wired him $250,000 to save his business. 2 weeks earlier, I had driven past a brand new house with his wife's car parked in the driveway. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I said the only sentence that mattered. You already got your last chance. Before I tell you what happened after that, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one, and if you've ever handed your child a lifeline only to watch them spend it on something else, I want you to know you are not alone in this room tonight. My name is Diane Whitfield. I am 62 years old, a retired hospital administrator, and I live alone in the same house outside Columbus, Ohio, where I raised my son Ryan after his father passed away when Ryan was 11. I worked 31 years at a regional medical center, first as a floor supervisor, then eventually running admissions and finance for the entire outpatient division. I understand budgets. I understand cash flow. I understand what it looks like when numbers do not add up, because I spent 3 decades making sure they did. Ryan is 34 now. He is a smart man, genuinely smart, the kind of smart that got him through an engineering degree without much effort, and then got bored sitting behind a desk at somebody else's company. 4 years ago, he left his stable job to start his own business, a specialty HVAC and smart home installation company called Whitfield Climate Solutions. He named it after our family, and I will admit, that detail meant something to me. I helped him with the first $15,000 for tools and a van. I told myself that was the last time. I was wrong, but not for the reasons you might think. Ryan married Kayla 3 years ago. She is not a bad person, not exactly. She grew up comfortable, the only daughter of a man who owned 2 car dealerships in Cincinnati, and she has never once in her life had to sit with a bank statement and figure out how to make a number stretch. She is warm to my face. She calls me Diane, never Mom, and she has a way of talking about money like it is weather, something that simply happens around her rather than something she has any responsibility for. I noticed this early. I chose to ignore it because Ryan loved her, and because I had learned a long time ago that criticizing your son's wife is a fast way to lose your son. The business struggled in its second year. That happens. Ryan called me late on a Tuesday night in March, and I could hear it in his voice before he said a word. That particular strain that used to mean a skinned knee when he was 7, and now meant something with far more zeros attached. He told me a commercial contract had fallen through, that he had already ordered the equipment for it, that 2 of his crews were sitting idle, and that if he did not make payroll by Friday, he was going to lose his best technicians to a competitor. He said he needed $60,000 to bridge the gap. Just a bridge, he said, just until the next contract closed. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not have $60,000 sitting in a checking account waiting to be handed over. What I had was 31 years of careful saving, a paid-off house, a modest but well-managed retirement account, and a life insurance policy from my late husband that had been sitting untouched since the day he died, because touching it always felt like touching him. I pulled $60,000 from that policy in March. I did not tell Ryan where it came from. I simply wired it. By June, he called again. This time, it was not a bridge. This time, he sat in my living room with a folder of projections, real projections, spreadsheets with his own logo in the corner, and he explained that the business needed real growth capital, not a patch. He wanted to expand into a second county, hire 2 more crews, and buy out a smaller competitor who was retiring. He asked for $190,000. Combined with the $60,000 from March, that would bring the total to $250,000, exactly a quarter of what I had spent 31 years building. I did something I am not entirely proud of, and something I am not entirely ashamed of either. I said yes, but I did not say yes blindly. I have spent my career reading financial documents, and I read every page of that business plan twice. I asked him hard questions. I asked him what would happen if the acquisition fell through, what his debt-to-income ratio would look like afterward, whether he had considered a business loan through a bank instead of through his mother. He told me banks were slow and his window to buy the competitor was closing in 3 weeks. He told me this was the moment that would define whether Whitfield Climate Solutions became a real regional company or stayed a two-truck operation forever. I called my attorney, a woman named Carol Ann Pierce, who has handled my affairs since Richard died, and I told her what I was considering. She drafted a promissory note, not because I distrusted my son exactly, but because 31 years in hospital finance teaches you that verbal agreements between family members are the single fastest way to destroy both the money and the family. Ryan signed it without complaint. The note specified the amount, a modest interest rate far below market, and a repayment structure that would begin in 18 months, once the acquisition had time to prove itself. I wired the money the following week. $250,000 gone from the account that represented my entire working life, sent into my son's business with nothing but a signature and a mother's faith holding it together. For a while, things seemed fine. Ryan called more often that summer, which I appreciated, though looking back I understand now that a lot of those calls were really about making sure I felt good about the money, not about actually including me in his life. He sent me a photo of the new crew uniforms with the Whitfield Climate Solutions logo on them. He sent me a screenshot of a new commercial contract, a school district, 43 units across 6 buildings. I remember standing in my kitchen looking at that screenshot and feeling something I had not felt in years, a kind of quiet pride that comes from watching something you built, even something you only helped build, actually work. Then, in September, my neighbor Patricia mentioned something at the mailbox. She said her cousin worked in real estate over in the Grandview Heights area, and that she had seen a listing come off the market fast, a beautiful 5-bedroom colonial with a pool, $420,000, sold to a young couple named Whitfield. I stood there holding my mail, and I told Patricia she must be mistaken. I told her Ryan and Kayla lived in a perfectly nice 3-bedroom rental in Westerville. I told myself the same thing all the way back into my house. I did not sleep well that night. The next morning I drove to Grandview Heights myself. I do not know exactly what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe a different family entirely, with a name that only sounded similar. What I found was Kayla's silver SUV parked in the driveway of a house with a moving truck backed up to the garage, and 2 men in matching t-shirts carrying a leather sectional sofa through the front door. I sat in my car across the street for almost 20 minutes. I did not go up to the door. I am not a woman who makes scenes in front of strangers, but I sat there long enough to watch Kayla come outside in workout clothes, laughing on her phone, directing the movers toward a room upstairs, entirely at home in a $420,000 house that I had never once heard mentioned. What I felt in that moment was not simple anger. It was closer to a kind of vertigo, the floor tilting slightly beneath something I thought was solid. I had handed my son $250,000 to save a struggling business from collapsing under payroll and equipment costs. I had watched him sign a promissory note that specifically outlined how tight things were, how urgent the timing was, how every dollar mattered. And somewhere in the middle of that urgency, he and Kayla had apparently found the room in their finances for a down payment on a house nearly $500,000 in value. I drove home, and I did not call him that day. I have learned across 62 years that the worst decisions I have ever made were the ones I made in the first hour after finding something out. So I waited. I made tea. I sat in Richard's old chair by the window, the one I still cannot bring myself to reupholster, and I thought about what I actually knew versus what I was assuming. I called Carol Ann the next morning instead of calling Ryan. I told her what I had seen. She asked me a series of very calm, very precise questions. Had I seen a deed? Had I seen a mortgage statement? Was it possible the house was a rental or a gift from Kayla's father, or something entirely unconnected to the money I had wired? I told her I did not know any of those things for certain. She told me that before I said one word to my son, I should find out. It took me 4 days working through public county property records, which in Ohio are a matter of public record and available to anyone willing to sit at a library computer and search by name. I found the deed, $420,000, purchased in August, 1 month before the neighbor mentioned it to me, financed with a mortgage of $340,000, which meant a down payment of $80,000 had come from somewhere. $80,000. I sat there staring at that number on the screen for a long time because it was almost exactly the amount I had wired him in March, the emergency bridge money, the payroll money, the money that was supposed to keep 2 crews from losing their jobs. I did not confront him yet. I wanted the full picture first. I requested, through Carol Ann, a look at whatever financial documentation existed connected to the promissory note, since as the lender I had a right to understand the state of an investment I had a legal stake in. Ryan resisted at first, told me it was complicated, told me the business had multiple accounts, and it would take time to pull everything together. It took him 3 weeks to send anything at all, and when he finally did, what he sent was incomplete, missing the acquisition paperwork entirely, missing bank statements from the exact months in question. While I waited for him to produce those documents, Ryan called me again. This was the Tuesday I mentioned at the very beginning. He came to the house in person this time, sat at my kitchen table where he had sat as a boy doing homework, and told me the acquisition of the smaller competitor had cost more than projected, that integrating the 2 companies had eaten through cash faster than expected, that he needed $80,000 to make it through the next quarter until a large contract paid out. $80,000, the same number as the down payment I had found on the deed. I do not believe that was a coincidence, and I do not believe you will either. I asked him one question before I said anything else. I asked him to tell me about the house in Grandview Heights. I watched my son's face change in a way I had genuinely never seen before, not as a child, not as a teenager, not even during his divorce scare 2 years into his marriage that I never mentioned to anyone. He went very still, and then he tried, almost immediately, to explain it as something separate from the business. He said the house was Kayla's decision, that her father had helped with part of the down payment, that it had nothing to do with the money I had lent Whitfield Climate Solutions. I let him finish. I let him say every word of it. Then I told him I had already pulled the deed, and I had already seen the mortgage amount, and the math simply did not support the story he was telling me. He did not have an answer for that. He sat there for a long time, and eventually what came out was closer to the truth, though I suspect not the entire truth even now. The business had, in fact, stabilized somewhat over the summer. Not as dramatically as the earlier updates suggested, but enough that Ryan and Kayla decided they deserved, in his words, to finally live like a successful business owner instead of like a struggling one. Kayla had been pushing to buy a house for over a year. Her friends had houses. Her sister had a house. Renting to her felt like an embarrassment that did not match the image Ryan had built for her about how well the business was doing. So they used a combination of a small business distribution. Ryan paid himself and, yes, part of the money that had originally come from me, though he insisted it was a loan he intended to repay to the business account eventually, not theft. He was careful to use that word, not theft. I told him I was not going to argue with him about definitions that night. I told him I needed time to think, and I asked him to leave the folder of updated financials with me, whatever he actually had. Then I said the sentence you already know. You already got your last chance. He left angry, which I expected, and he left convinced, I could tell, that I would come around within a week or 2 the way I always had before. That is the part I want to speak to directly, because I think many of you watching have lived some version of this. There is a pattern that develops between a generous parent and a child who has learned, whether they mean to or not, that generosity is a renewable resource. It never occurs to them that the well might actually run dry, because it never has before. Ryan was not a cruel person. He was a person who had simply never been told no in a way that stuck. I spent the next 2 weeks doing the kind of work that 31 years in hospital administration trained me to do without flinching. I went back to Carol Ann with everything I had found. I authorized a full formal accounting request under the terms of the promissory note, which specifically granted me, as the lender, the right to review the company's financial records upon reasonable request, a clause Ryan had signed without reading closely because he never imagined I would use it. Carol Ann sent the request through proper legal channels this time, not as a mother asking her son for honesty, but as a creditor exercising a contractual right. What came back over the following month painted a fuller picture than even I had expected. The business had, in fact, closed the school district contract, generating real revenue. But instead of using that revenue to pay down the acquisition debt or rebuild a cash reserve the way any responsible business owner would, Ryan and Kayla had drawn an owner distribution of $92,000 in July, 1 month before closing on the house. The business itself was carrying more debt than Ryan had disclosed to me at the time of the original ask, including a separate small business loan he had taken out through an online lender at a significantly higher interest rate than mine, which he had used to cover a shortfall that occurred, according to the dates, almost immediately after my $250,000 arrived. In other words, my money had not saved a struggling business the way he described it to me. It had allowed him to take on a lifestyle he could not otherwise afford, while quietly patching the actual operational gaps with more expensive debt underneath it, hoping it would all sort itself out before anyone looked too closely. I do not believe Ryan sat down one day and planned to deceive me from the beginning. I believe, and I say this as someone who has watched a great many people make a great many financial decisions over a long career, that he made one small compromising choice, then another, and each one made the next one easier to justify to himself, until the distance between what he told his mother and what was actually happening in his bank account had grown wider than he ever intended. That did not change what I needed to do. Carol Ann and I discussed my options carefully. I had a valid, signed promissory note. I had documentation showing the funds had been used, at least in significant part, outside the stated purpose of the loan. I had the right, under the terms of that note, to call the loan due immediately upon evidence of misuse of funds, a clause Carol Ann had specifically included because, in her words, hope is not a strategy when $250,000 is involved. I want to be clear that I did not do this out of a desire for revenge. I did it because at 62 years old, having spent my entire life being careful and responsible with money, I was not willing to quietly absorb the loss of a retirement asset so that my son and his wife could live in a house with a pool while I ate into the very last cushion I had built for my own old age. I asked Carol Ann to send formal notice calling the loan due in full, with the accrued interest specified in the note, payable within 90 days as the agreement allowed. I also asked her to include, as documentation, the property records for the Grandview Heights house and a summary of the owner distributions taken in July. Not as an accusation exactly, but as a plain statement of fact establishing why I no longer believed additional funds were warranted. Ryan called me the day the letter arrived. He was not angry this time. He was frightened, and underneath the fear I could hear something that sounded almost like relief, the way people sometimes sound when a pressure they have been carrying alone finally becomes visible to someone else. He told me he did not have $250,000 obviously, and that calling the loan due would force the business into a crisis it might not survive. I told him that was, unfortunately, a consequence of decisions that had already been made before that letter ever went out. I did not raise my voice. I have found, across many difficult conversations in my life, both professional and personal, that raising your voice only gives the other person permission to focus on your tone instead of the facts in front of them. What followed over the next several months was not the dramatic implosion you might expect from a story like this. Ryan and Kayla did not lose the house immediately. What happened instead was slower and, in some ways, more instructive. Facing the reality of the called note, Ryan brought in an outside business consultant, something he had resisted doing for 2 years because, he admitted to me later, he did not want anyone confirming what he suspected, that his margins were too thin and his growth too fast for the size of his cash reserves. The consultant recommended selling off 2 of the newly acquired routes from the smaller competitor, the same acquisition that had originally justified my $190,000 contribution, back to a regional competitor for a modest sum, enough to bring the business back into a stable, if smaller, operating position. To cover the promissory note, Ryan and Kayla ultimately made the decision, and I want to say clearly, this was their decision, not one I dictated to them, to sell the Grandview Heights house. It had appreciated slightly in the few months they owned it, enough that after paying off the mortgage and closing costs, they were able to pay me back $140,000 of the $250,000 immediately, with a restructured payment plan for the remainder over the following 3 years, now at a market rate interest, since I had, in Carol Ann's words, already extended more grace on pricing than most lenders ever would. Kayla did not speak to me for nearly 4 months after the house sold. I understood that, and I did not push it. From what Ryan has told me since, she felt humiliated, felt that I had orchestrated the loss of her dream home out of spite, and for a long time she was not entirely wrong to feel that the consequences landed hardest on her, even though the choices had been made together. I have thought about this a great deal, and I do not believe I owe her an apology for enforcing a legal agreement my son signed with his own hand. But I also recognize that watching your home get sold out from under you, regardless of the reasons, is a genuinely painful experience, and I have tried, where I can, to hold both of those truths at once. What I did not do, through any of this, was cut Ryan off entirely, and I think that distinction matters. I did not stop loving my son. I did not stop taking his calls or showing up when he needed me for something that was not financial. What I stopped doing was writing checks without boundaries, without documentation, without consequences attached when those boundaries were crossed. There is a difference between generosity and enabling, and it took me 62 years and $250,000 to draw that line clearly enough that even my own heart could not talk me out of holding it. Ryan and Kayla now rent a smaller house, 3 bedrooms, a decent yard, nothing extravagant, in the same general area they lived in before all of this began. The business, smaller now, but genuinely profitable for the first time in its history, according to the consultant's most recent report, continues to make monthly payments on the restructured note, on time, every month, for 11 months now. Ryan calls me most Sundays. Some of those calls are still about the business, but most of them lately are not. Last month, he asked me, almost sheepishly, whether I still had any of Richard's old woodworking tools in the garage, because he wanted to learn how to build something with his hands that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or contracts or the particular kind of pressure that comes from wanting people to believe you are more successful than you actually are. I gave him the tools. I did not give him any more money. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house once a conflict like this finally resolves, and it is not the triumphant quiet you might expect from a story with a clean ending. It is slower and more complicated. I still think about that folder of projections Ryan brought me back in June, the careful spreadsheets with his logo in the corner, and I wonder now how much of it he believed himself in that moment. I have decided it does not matter as much as I once thought it did. What matters is what happened after the truth came out. Ryan chose to change eventually, even if it took a called loan and a sold house to get him there. Patricia still mentions the whole thing sometimes at the mailbox, and I have found that I do not mind talking about it anymore. For a long time I felt an odd embarrassment, as though my son misleading me somehow reflected poorly on my own judgment for trusting him. I do not feel that way now. Raising a good person does not guarantee they will never make a selfish decision under pressure. It guarantees they are capable of coming back from it, once someone finally holds up a mirror and refuses to look away first. If there is one thing I would want another parent watching this to understand, it is this. Love for your child does not require you to dissolve every boundary you have ever built for yourself. I spent 31 years teaching myself, professionally, how to look at a set of numbers honestly, without letting hope or pressure or affection distort what they actually said. It took me far too long to apply that same discipline to my own family, because somewhere along the way I had convinced myself that loving Ryan meant trusting him without verification, and that verification itself was some kind of betrayal of that love. It is not. A signed agreement between a mother and a son is not a lack of faith. It is, in its own way, one of the most respectful things you can offer someone you love, because it treats them as a capable adult responsible for their own choices, rather than a child who gets to keep asking indefinitely and never has to answer for where the money actually went. I do not know if Ryan and Kayla will ever fully understand how close they came to losing far more than a house that year. I know that I understand it clearly, and I know that the version of myself who sat in that car across the street in Grandview Heights, watching movers carry a leather sofa into a house I had unknowingly helped pay for, made a decision that day that I have not once regretted since. You already got your last chance. Sometimes the kindest thing you can say to the people you love most is exactly that sentence, said calmly, said once, and then followed through on completely. If this story reminded you of your own family, of your own son or daughter, of your own quiet moment sitting with a bank statement wondering how far your generosity is supposed to stretch before it becomes something else entirely, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently or what you did the same. And if you believe that real love sometimes requires a boundary instead of another check, please like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and I will see you in the next one.